Now on BBC Two, a Newsnight local election special with Jeremy Paxman.
It's bad for the Tories, but how bad? The Deputy Prime Minister is here to make the best he can of it. Good evening. In today's local elections, the last big test of opinion before a general election, they're counting the votes. In a few minutes, we'll have the best indication yet of whether the government can survive. Peter Snow is in the election studio.
Of the 150 councils being contested today, no fewer than 79 had blue town halls, Conservative controlled, when Margaret Thatcher took power in 1979. Now, since then, most of them have melted away, leaving just 4 councils controlled by the Conservatives. How many of those will still be Conservative after tonight's count?
We've outside broadcasts at counts around the country, including in Macclesfield and Huntingdon, which between them make up half the remaining Tory councils in England. And the Deputy Prime Minister joins us, along with his Labour counterpart and the Liberal Democrat head of campaigns. Also tonight, the people who loathe Western values so much, they've even strung up the televisions. John Simpson reports from inside Afghanistan.
For more than a year now, the Taliban movement has swept through Afghanistan. We've come to the city of Kandahar, its base, to see perhaps the most rigid form of Islamic fundamentalism practiced anywhere in the world.
Today's elections for 3,000 seats on 150 councils in England are what politicians like to call the only poll that counts, real votes for real politicians. The polls closed an hour ago. A few results are already in. With a bit of luck, we should have enough to establish a pattern within the next 15 or 20 minutes. Let's go straight to a couple of our outside broadcasts and find out what's going on. Mark Mardell is down at Labour Party campaign headquarters. What's the feeling down there, Mark?
Well, the feeling is that it's actually too early to tell anything at the moment. The only thing we've heard so far is from Redditch, which is a very safe Labour seat, and they say here that the Conservative councillor, one Conservative councillor there, has already handed back his pass because he's given up and decided he's lost. But it really is too early to get too much of a mood. It's a game of expectations. What they don't want here, us to compare it against, is against 92, a month after the general election when Labour really got wiped out in the local elections. What they want us to compare it with is a similar period to now, a year before 91, a year before the general election, when they were just 1% ahead of the Conservatives. They say they've got to be doing a lot better than that to be on course to win the general election. And of course they're expecting to be doing a heck of a lot better than that, probably sort of 13 or something like that percentage ahead of the Tories.
Right, thank you very much, Mark. Carolyn, Quinn is at Liberal Democrat headquarters. Are they any better informed down there?
No, not really. They're not expecting the district shire results to come through until about 11 o'clock, but they are optimistic. Obviously, they're pointing out that numerically we're not going to have the sort of landslide results that there were last time, but they are hoping to gain between 50 and 100 seats. Although really for them, they need to get over 100 to show that they're not being dominated too much by the Blair effect throughout the country.
Carolyn, thank you very much. Well, we're going to go over now to Basildon and Jeremy Vine. Basildon, of course, you remember the crucial seat which told the Conservatives they'd won the general election last time round. It was a Conservative council. Jeremy, what's the expectation there?
Well, they're just waiting to see whether they can hang on at all in the council. As you say, in the 80s, it was a very different story. Kevin, it was said, bought his council house, and Sharon worked as a PA to a managing director. Since then, house prices have fallen, and people have been bounced out of their jobs by the problems with the economy. And in fact, the whole status of this seat as a parliamentary totem for the Conservatives has gone away. The local MP, David Amos, is moving, in fact, to Southend. The question here, Jeremy, as far as the council is concerned, is whether the Conservatives can hang on to any seats at all, because the 14 seats they won in 1992 are all up for grabs tonight, and those are the only seats they hold on the council. And earlier today, we were speaking to some voters as they came out from the polling booths.
Well, I voted for Labour. The reason is that I just don't think that this is my protest against the government itself of Maids, and I just think they're an absolute failure.
I feel they have let us down very badly. Very badly. They have destroyed everything in this country, and I've come to the conclusion, even today, that they have destroyed themselves.
I voted for the Liberal Democrat because there's no way I'd vote for the Tories after the complete hash they've made of things. And frankly, I'm disenchanted with Labour because they won't tell me what they're doing.
I voted Conservative today, and I believe it's because I go to a grammar school, and I think that the Conservative Party have done a good job in maintaining grammar schools, and I'd like to see them continue.
I've always voted Conservative until now, and I've changed now because of the way they're treating the country and the way they're doing things with the common market and all that business.
I voted Tory. The reason is, to be quite honest, I don't think there's a lot of difference between either of them. But I think if the Labour Party get in, I think the ordinary people will be taxed up to their eyebrows.
I voted Liberal. I think they're more or less even Stevens party, you know, it won't be too radical on one side or the other. The Conservatives have had it. I think they'll have to pull their socks up if they want to get in for the general election. This election just reflects what the country's thinking.
There about the Conservatives and about the government are particularly important because you may well find, Jeremy, if there's a very bad result here, that those criticisms of Mr. Major and his government are repeated by local Conservatives in Basildon.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. Let's go over now to the main election studio and join our resident boffin, Peter Kellner, who's got what results have come in so far. Is there any pattern so far, Peter?
Well, Jeremy, we've had 22 of our key wards, the ones we're watching most carefully, have come in so far. Mainly, it must be said, from safe Labour inner-city areas. But the story is quite consistent. The Conservatives was well down on 4 years ago when these seats were last contested, but a bit up on last year, 2 or 3 points on average up on last year's share in these inner-city wards. We had 1 or 2 other wards. The Liberal Democrats have captured a ward from the Conservatives in Eastleigh. Too early to make a firm projection, but my guess is the Tories will not be quite as badly placed as they were on this night a year ago.
Peter, thank you. Well, the one thing we can say with certainty is that the politicians wheeled out by party headquarters tonight and tomorrow have already got their lines ready. The spin doctors have been preparing them for months on what to say if the worst comes to the worst. Bill Bush of the BBC's political unit has been thinking himself into the politicians' shoes. First, the Conservatives. In the general election of 1992, the Tories gained 43% of the vote. But on the basis of last year's local elections, they'd have got only 25%. Today's predictions are gloomy too. So how to make more losses look like gains?
The whole point about this is to make sure that expectations are as low as possible beforehand. So when you exceed them, when you do a bit better than that, it looks like a success. So the party hacks say to the party bosses in the closed rooms before they get anywhere near a studio, play expectations. And it'll go something like this. You said we'd lose 1,000 seats. You said it would be a bloodbath, a meltdown. It's nothing like that. Of course we've lost seats, but nothing like the 1,000 that you said we would.
The Liberal Democrats got 18% in the last general election, making some improvement last year with 24% of the vote. How would they put a gloss on a disappointing result?
They're a third party. That means they're always vulnerable to the charge that a Lib Dem vote is a wasted vote. Only the big two parties can form a government. So what we'll hear from them is they're not a third party at all. They're a second party. They're not a local party at all. They're a national party. That's the message they'll want to get over. So we won't hear them talk about vote share too much more about the number of council seats they're winning and the town halls they control.
And how would Labour talk things up? They got 35% of the vote in the general election. Last year their share was up to 46%. But after the huge opinion poll leads, what if they're disappointed tonight?
They soar high in the opinion polls, and although they do well in local elections, they do less well than their opinion poll rating. So they won't want to talk about polls. And if the BBC or any journalist pushes them on polls, they'll say something like this. Opinion polls. No one trusts them. They always get the answer wrong. BBC should know that. It's made more mistakes on polls than all the others put together. Let's look at real votes. It's real votes that matters.
Well, we'll see what they really have to say in a moment or two when we'll have some results, and we'll be talking to 2 of the big beasts of the British political jungle, John Prescott and Michael Heseltine, together with Nick Harvey, shortly when we've got, as I say, a few more results in. But now, the second of John Simpson's reports from the forgotten war in Afghanistan. The Taliban movement first burst on the notice of the world when it began laying siege to Kabul last year. Since then, it has tightened its grip on much of the country. Only last month, its leader proclaimed himself leader of all Muslims and declared a jihad or holy war against the government of Afghanistan. The Taliban is the most fundamentalist Islamic political movement in the world and normally shuns outside scrutiny. But John Simpson has had the most extensive access ever obtained by any television reporter to the areas they now control.
We're being driven up to the front line, and the Taliban commander is playing his favourite music cassette. "Why are you crying, mother?" says the song. "You raised me as a Talib. I'm used to the rockets and the burning flames. If I don't bring Islamic law to Afghanistan, there'll be no room for me in heaven." These men belong to what is probably the most fundamentalist Islamic movement on earth, and the most fanatical, its enemies would say. But even they would have to admit it was also one of the most successful. And this is the high point of their success. The Taliban offensive has brought them all the way to the mountaintops overlooking Kabul. Government forces are close here. Every now and then they fire across at the Taliban positions. The Taliban forces have held these positions for a year, and nothing that the government's been able to throw at them has managed to dislodge them. By now they control half the country and more than half the population. But who are they? Where does their strength come from? And what part does their extreme religious fundamentalism play in their success?
We are working for Sharia, that is, Islamic law to be implemented across the country. We will not give up our task. We don't want official positions. All we want to do is fulfill Allah's command. President Rabbani and the Kabul government don't like it. They've refused it, so we've declared holy war on them.
The Taliban are at the cutting edge of Islamic conservatism. This is where their movement started 2 years ago. A madrasa, or Islamic religious school, in the Pakistani town of Quetta, just across the border from Afghanistan. The class of 100 12 to 16-year-olds is learning the Holy Quran by heart. Afghan refugee students here, angry that the Mujahideen government in their home country had failed to introduce the full force of Islamic law, formed themselves into a fighting force and swept across the border. Hence the name. Taliban means religious students. The head of the madrasa is a member of Pakistan's Senate. He belongs to a small religious party with close links to Afghanistan.
The
Taliban movement is a new movement in Afghanistan, but it's also the continuation of the Holy War. For America and Europe, that war finished when the Soviet Union was defeated, but for the younger generation of Afghans, it still hasn't achieved its purpose. And when they saw that their sacrifice was fruitless, it was natural that this movement would come to the boil and they would return.
The Taliban's return was swift and at first extraordinarily successful. In just over a year, they swept across much of the country, suppressing the gangs of robbers and the warring factions by persuasion and, if necessary, by force. Nowadays, they control the south of the country up to the outskirts of the capital, Kabul, which is still held by the government. Their advance from Quetta has taken them along the important strategic road which links Pakistan with Afghanistan, then on to Central Asia, and eventually Russia. We followed this route first to the city of Kandahar, the Taliban's political and religious center. The city was badly damaged in the war against the Russians. The huge graveyard on the outskirts is a sign of the heavy loss of life here.
2 years ago, Kandahar was in chaos, divided up among mutually hostile warlords. The Taliban broke through the warlords' checkpoints with a supply convoy. That gave them huge public support, and they kept a firm grip on the city ever since. A mullah was assigned to us to make sure we didn't film the wrong things. The leaders of the Taliban try to forbid any images of living creatures. They believe it constitutes idolatry. The mullah even told us we couldn't film the most startling symbol of their hostility to television. They'd strung up television sets with videotape at the entrance to the city centre. The message couldn't be clearer. The society which the Taliban have created here in Kandahar is probably just about the most extreme form of Islamic fundamentalism that you could find anywhere in the world. By comparison, Iran and even Saudi Arabia seem positively liberal and open. Directly the Taliban took over here, they banned football, chess and the flying of kites. Their vehicles patrol the streets constantly. Women must either stay indoors, or if they appear in public, they have to wear the burqa, which covers everything, even the face. There was a tremendous stir in Kandahar. We followed the crowds to a mosque in the city centre. The Taliban had been holding an assembly of mullahs from all over Afghanistan. Now the results were about to be made public. A holy war was announced against the government of President Rabbani in Kabul. And the head of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, was declared to be the Amir, or leader of all Muslims everywhere. Because this was regarded as a key moment for the Afghan nation, Mullah Omar displayed the holy cloak of the Prophet Muhammad to the crowd. It's kept in Kandahar and is shown only at times of crisis. The last time was 60 years ago. Neither the cloak nor the ceremony has ever been filmed before, nor has Mullah Omar. People in the crowd threw up their turbans to touch the cloak and be blessed by it. It was like being at some great religious ceremony in the Middle Ages. The Taliban have made Kandahar quieter and more law-abiding than it's been for years. They're cooperating with the Red Cross to build a new hospital. We went there to meet the Taliban health minister, Mullah BALUCH, as he heard petitions. He's the one member of the Taliban ruling council here who'd agree to be interviewed on camera. That would seem to make him a liberal. But with the Taliban, liberal is a relative term. Mullah BALUCH, as Minister of Health, likes to carry out the sentences of Islamic law himself. In other words, he cuts off the hands and feet of criminals. He's done it twice this year so far. These are two of the cases that recently came under his charge. Both men were convicted of theft, and they were punished in full accordance with the Sharia laws. Mullah BALUCH feels that men like this are unlikely to reoffend.
We punish criminals according to Sharia Islamic law. When someone steals or robs, that law decrees that his left hand or right foot should be amputated. If they commit the same crime again, then his right hand or left foot should also be removed, so he can't do it again. The amputations are carried out by doctors and surgeons.
As Minister of Health, you support the notion that doctors should cut off the hands of people?
We have no animosity with the people themselves. It's the Sharia that decrees we do it.
So the Taliban have established here the society they were formed to create, a society in which Islamic law is given its full force. An eye for an eye. For a convicted murderer, there can only be one penalty. But is there more to the Taliban than this kind of rough justice? We headed westwards, out of Kandahar, to see how they governed some of the other parts of their new empire. The road westward out of the city may not be good, but it's the strategic key to the whole of this part of Central Asia. Whoever controls the road controls the trade route from Pakistan to the republics of the former Soviet Union. It's exactly what the Pakistanis want. Last September, with Pakistan's encouragement, the Taliban pushed further and further along this road. They aren't, as it happens, very good fighters, but they are good at persuading the factions along their way to join forces with them. The embattled Afghan government in Kabul believes it was all done for Pakistan's benefit.
Taliban
was created by the Pakistani intelligence services and by its Interior Minister, General BABAR, for their own purposes. Their leaders are puppets of Pakistan, even if the foot soldiers of their organization may be unaware of the links.
I put that to General Babar, the Pakistani government minister who first encouraged the Taliban to start their campaign.
We have got no favorites, we have had no favorites, and we have not been supportive of anyone in that manner. So it is purely the consumer goods, the telephone or some other facility that we are providing, but that does not in any manner sort of help them in their war with the central government or other things.
Last September, the road took the Taliban to Herat, Afghanistan's second city. It was a huge prize, and they won it almost without firing a shot. But they'd reached alien territory now. The Taliban speak Pashto. Herat is a city of Persian speakers, civilized and sophisticated. The Taliban began imposing their fundamentalist ideas on it. They hacked off any representations of living creatures, just as they banned television pictures, because they're idolatrous. This fountain was designed by Herat's most famous artist. Local people were appalled. Women have usually been freer in Herat than elsewhere in Afghanistan. Now the Taliban ordered them to stay at home or cover themselves in the burqa, which is a traditional Pashto garment, nothing whatever to do with the Persian culture of Herat. They closed down the girls' schools and sent the women teachers home. The school's principal showed us around.
The last lesson they had, was it?
Nothing had changed here since the day the Taliban had moved in some force, and ordered everyone out of the school. For the educated people of the city in particular, the arrival of the Taliban was the start of a nightmare which hasn't gone away. We could only find one woman who was prepared to speak out about it all. Normally, she'd never willingly have worn a burqa, but this was the only way of hiding her identity.
Our life is bitter because we're not free. One day I went to the school and the door was closed, and they told me that women aren't allowed to come here anymore and should stay at home. It's not possible to learn anything or educate your children. They've been pressing us to wear the burqa. We are not allowed to show our faces to strangers. Many women hate the Taliban.
We were invited to meet the Taliban governor as he held court. He was hospitable, but definitely a backwoodsman. We couldn't film him in close-up. Our audience with him began with a prayer.
We want everyone in America to convert to Islam. We are inviting the King of America and the King of Russia to convert to Islam.
I asked him about Taliban's control over Herat.
God be praised, there is no one in Herat who opposes us. The people of Herat have promised us, some of them are sitting here and you can ask them, but they're not against us.
But out in the streets we had clear evidence this wasn't true. As we parked in order to do some filming, a passerby threw a note into the vehicle. Our translator read it out.
Dear BBC correspondent, I cannot mention my name in this letter for you because I'm afraid there is no right of saying anything because they are going to beat us and kill us. I want to tell you to pass the message for all of the world and for Afghanistan people that we are not anymore human beings under the control of Taliban here in Herat.
The atmosphere was very tense. The slightest incident, this traffic accident involving a Taliban driver, for instance, could blow up into something much bigger and more threatening. Only 7 months after their triumphant entry into the city, the Taliban seemed like an army of occupation, bitterly resented. They've certainly gone a long way to achieving their original aim, the introduction of full Islamic law in Afghanistan. Beyond that, though, the men of Taliban have no real political ideas at all. They're still very powerful, and they certainly will have their part to play. But it's hard to think now that they can take over the country and run it on their own.
John Simpson in Afghanistan. Tomorrow night, in the last of his series, John Simpson investigates the soaring production of heroin in Afghanistan. Well, back now to the local elections here in England, the biggest test of public opinion before the next general election. Results are beginning now to come in. Mark Mardell is down at Labour Party headquarters, where they're monitoring these things closely. What have they discovered so far, Mark?
Well, earlier the mood here was one rather of talking about rain and talking about how there might have been a low turnout, but they're not exactly dancing on the streets, dancing on the tables yet, but the mood is picking up. They say they've taken Hertsmere from no overall control. That's the first Labour gain in Hertfordshire. Also in Amber Valley, which will be a key marginal in a general election, the Tory deputy leader has lost their seats. There are 6 other Labour gains, 2 in Yarmouth, 1 in Chorley, Bassett Law, Hyndburn, that's from the Liberal Democrats, that's quite interesting, they're taking 1 from the Liberal Democrats, and 1 in Birmingham. And it's places like Birmingham that I think we're going to find very significant in the end, or places like Peterborough, or as we've heard earlier, Basildon, where they're going to be parliamentary marginals. See how they're doing there.
Any pattern yet established as to the size of the vote?
It's very difficult. It is too early to say anything like that at the moment.
OK, well, let's see if how the Tories are reading it. John Sopel is down at a Conservative Central Office. What's the feeling down there, John?
Jeremy, it's a sort of mood of cheerful pessimism. They know that they're going to be in for a rough evening. Well, they do. They're sort of smiling happily and saying, well, it's been rather patchy on the ground. It's been very difficult. They've lost so many councillors over the past few years that you lose so many of your foot soldiers that way. And they say that, you know, in some areas there have been more party workers out than last year, in other areas less. And I think they feel rather gloomy that it's not going to be a very good evening for them. But they're not going to make predictions yet. They say they want to see the share of the vote. They say they want to see a representative sample before they're going to commit themselves to whether it's a good or a bad evening. I suppose what they're looking for is a better result than they had last year.
So a cheerful pessimism is another way of saying they haven't a clue what's going on?
Well, I think they've got a pretty good idea of what's going on. I don't think they're going to second guess, though, until they've seen enough results coming in. I think they recognise that they're in for a pretty rotten evening.
But not as rotten as it might have been?
Well, that's what they're hoping.
Right, OK. Well, now, Krishnan Gurumurthy is down at Runnymede, which is a Conservative-controlled council, or was until today. What's happening down there, Krishnan?
Well, Jeremy, it looks like everything that Conservatives feared would happen is happening. This is, as you said, one of those 4 Conservative councils, or was one of those 4 Conservative councils. The Tories only needed to lose 2 seats for the council to go to no overall control, and the Labour group here are saying they've got those 2 seats. It's not clear just how well Labour are going to go on to do and whether they're going to manage to take control of the council, but there's already a recount on another hotly contested marginal.
Krishnan, you spent some time down there in the last week or so. Wasn't this one of those places where people seem to be switching directly from Conservative to Labour, and if so, why?
Well, that's right. The Liberal Democrats are very much out of the frame here. What we were seeing on the doorstep and what the local Conservatives admit that they've seen on the doorstep is people simply voting on national issues and saying they've had enough, they want to send a message to Westminster, and therefore they're not just going to abstain, they're not just going to vote for the Liberal Democrats, but they're going to vote Labour, as one man put it to me, to give a kick to the Conservatives in London.
Krishnan, thank you. Well, let's go over now to Exeter and join Mike Fennell. Exeter was, up until today, Labour Council. What's happening down there? Well, evidently, whatever it is, we can't hear what it is. We'll try and get back to you a little later, Mike Fennell. Problem with the sound there, obviously. Let's go over now to the general election studio, the local election studio, and join Peter Snow.
Jeremy, 3,000 wards counting tonight, of which we've selected 800 key wards in which we can calculate the vote and the changes in the vote, and thus calculate a projected national share, an estimated national share, if this pattern were reflected all over the country. Now, of the key wards, Quite a few have counted so far. It's still very early indeed, and this is a tentative estimate on our part. But with 126,000 votes counted in this local government election in 74 of those key wards, all of them typical, very typical representation, all the wards altogether, of the whole vote count in this local election, we estimate that the projected national share, the estimated national share, if this pattern of voting was reflected all over the country, is Labour on 44, well up on what they were in 92. That's why that's the party that's going to be making the gains in councillors in this election. The Tories, 28%, way down on what they were in the last time these seats were contested in 92. The Liberal Democrats on 23%, and the others on 5%. Now, of course, what is actually is interesting in this in many ways is how this compares with the disaster the Tories suffered and Labour's great triumph last year in the local elections, when both of them were a record. A record for the Tories in terms of low and Labour in terms of high. And the change on 1995 that all this represents is that Labour are slightly down from their all-time high last year, if this is reflected in results through the night. The Tories slightly up on their terrible 25%, the worst they've ever had in local elections last year, just 3% up, so perhaps a slight recovery showing here, and the Liberal Democrats 1% down. Back to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Peter. Well, Peter Kellner is also in the election studio to try to give us some assessment of what we can read into this so far. Peter.
Jeremy, there's an interesting pattern emerged in that the Tories are picking up in the Labour areas. They've picked up from a really awful performance last year in the northern cities. But in their own wards, in their own parts of England, they're not doing nearly as well, possibly no better than last year. We've had so far 40 wards in that the Conservatives were defending tonight. Of those 40 wards, Labour have taken 21, the Liberal Democrats have taken 7, and the Conservatives have successfully defended only 12 of them. So the Tories may be picking up nationally, but within that, it may be not such a good night for them.
And from what you know of these things, Peter, is this pattern likely to sustain through the evening, or is it too early to say?
Well, certainly the pattern of these two kinds of contests will go through the evening. What we don't yet know is how it'll even out. At the moment, we're guessing that once all the results are in, the net effect will be a slight increase in the Conservative national share, as Peter Snow showed. But those figures could move either way. The Conservatives could creep up towards 30%, they could come back down towards 26%, which would be barely any improvement on last year. Right. This would be quite an exciting and tense night for the party strategists of all the parties.
Peter Kellner, thank you. Well, let's see what the politicians make of it. John Prescott, Labour's Deputy Leader, is here in the studio, along with Nick Harvey, the Liberal Democrats' campaign's boss, and Michael Heseltine joins us from Westminster. Well, it's a great honour to have the Deputy Prime Minister. Mr Heseltine, are you here to hail a great triumph of getting up possibly to 28%?
Well, my overwhelming impression about these is of sympathy for the people who fight local elections, because they sweat their guts out as councillors, and yet they know that they're actually involved very much in national tests of opinion with relatively low turnouts. And I think it is a great shame, because people give their time and effort to voluntary work, commitment to the local community, and some very good people lose their seats, which they don't deserve to, and it's nothing to do with their performance. That's my first feeling. The second feeling
with the performance of your government, then, by implication.
I was just going to say, and that's the second point that I wanted to make. More nonsense will be talked tonight by people trying to project results than characteristically is talked on most nights. You see, no, but it is an interesting point. It is a serious point that I actually did get the figures. In 1986, we lost 717 council seats. In 1991, we lost 872 council seats. From the whole place, we had all these great forecasts about Labour advances and goodness knows what. In 1987, we won the general election. In 1992, just a year later, in both cases, John Major got the largest vote in the history of the Tory party. So the idea that this has got anything to do with the general election at all is just a spit in the face of reality. But the only thing one can see so far, and I don't want to make a great issue of it, because, as I say, these are not reflections on what's going to happen in the general election, is that actually it looks as though the Tory recovery, which we've been talking about, has been maintained. That's right. The first indication.
Been maintained. John Prescott, is that how you read it?
No, certainly not. I can understand why Mr Heseltine wants to paint it that way, but the reality is what you have to get is the proportion of the votes or the seats. Your people were talking before. What is it? Proportion If Labour goes up, as they're suggesting, to 44%, that's a very high poll, and compared to 1991, which Mr Heseltine is talking about, the difference between the parties was 1 point.
Yeah,
this will make a considerable of 10 or something. If it's a matter of seats, they lost 2,000 seats last time, and I think we're likely to get more than 500 seats, and the world will be very pleased about that, according to the independent analysis I see in the Daily Telegraph, and call it independent. And if the Tories get less than, actually would do worse than that, and lose 500 and lose more than 500, they're doing very badly, and I think that's the judgment to make.
Nick Harvey, the prediction for you of 23% is tremendously disappointing, isn't it?
Well, it's a great deal better than our current national opinion poll standing, and certainly if we could get 23% in a general election, it would imply a big gain in seats.
But this is supposed to be your strong suit.
Well, this is a set of elections that isn't in our natural strong terrain. There aren't many seats up tonight in either the southwest or in Scotland, so we're defending perhaps some of the parts of the country we wouldn't normally expect to do well in. But we think we're going to make an advance tonight. We think we're going to go forward. We're defending a good set of results, and if we can go forward on those and make another gain of 50 or 100 seats, we'll be very pleased that that implies gains for us at the general election.
Mr Heseltine, there is less than a year to go to a general election. On this basis, you're going to lose it.
Well, you see, the interesting thing, I think Peter Kellner was making this point, that where Labour are in power, people have rumbled them. Up go the council taxes. Everybody knows that under Labour, all taxes will go up, because that's what Labour always does. And so the fact is that the experience of Labour in power puts people off. Whereas it's true that in our seats we're still seeing something of a protest. But when it comes to the general election, then the focus of attention will be on Labour policies as opposed to Labour soundbites. And we will have had a year in which people will have seen the benefits of a Conservative recovery, the tax reductions, the interest rate reductions.
It's just utter contempt here for the electorate by Mr Heseltine.
John Prescott, I know you haven't anything to do except interrupt me to bluster away, and I know you don't get much chance
to talk. Most of the time, but it's just utter contempt you have for the electorate, Mr Heseltine. Why don't you come and sit in this studio with us and debate the issue instead of hiding away in Millbank trying to get all your bits and pieces in?
Look, I know your own leader won't talk to you, and therefore you try to
What the heck has that got to do with it?
Substitute to talk to the deputy leader of the Conservative. Deputy Prime Minister of the Conservative Party, but you must keep your frustrations under control.
How many councils do the Tories now control? How many councils? Do you know 14 councils are the only councils you've got left? And you've the audacity to say to all your councillors, we are with you, when you've destroyed your council by the sheer incompetency of your government. What has been the issue in this council has been the incompetency of the government, the Prime Minister, and particularly yourself.
I'm going to interrupt you there, John Prescott, because hang on a sec, Mr Heseltine. We've got some news here, Mr Heseltine. Hang on, please. Hang on. Here's a question of fact as opposed to opinion. I gather that Labour have taken Basildon. Jeremy Vine is down there. Jeremy, what's happening?
Well, the answer is that it's almost as loud here as it is with you, Jeremy. Yes, Labour have taken control now from no overall control. We've had, I think, 8 results. 7 of them have been Tory seats going to Labour. Remember, 15 seats are up for election tonight. They include the 14 seats, the only 14 Tory seats on the council. So Labour have made pretty short work of the Conservatives tonight. They are now in control of Basildon, and that rather removes its status as this Tory totem, which goes back, of course, to 1992, when it was the seat that triggered or was seen to herald the Tory general election victory. Conservatives controlled the council in 92. They certainly don't tonight, and just down on the floor here, Labour are celebrating, and the Conservatives over there looking pretty glum.
Right, John Prescott, do you want to take this opportunity to gloat, or...?
Well, no, I certainly welcome it, but no doubt. Hartsmith we've got in, we've said before, Runnymede it's now possible. We've gained now, I see, in new towns like Harlow, we've gained seats in Exeter and Gloucester. These are areas that are key seat areas for Labour in which we have to win, and it's beginning to look very, very good, even on those limited results. I don't know what Mr Heseltine's got to say about it, but certainly on these results it bodes well for Labour in the coming general election.
Yeah, well, this is, I'm going to say exactly what I said earlier on. You said all this before the 1987 election, before the 1992 election, on the same basis, the same evidence, and actually you lost the general election. because the truth of the matter is, when we get
You held Basildon then.
Can we get to the point, when you get to a general election, people will consider Labour policies, and everybody knows what Labour policies are, because you can see it in local government, where, what is it, on average, £225 extra on council taxes in Labour authority. That's why you're not doing so well in Labour authorities, because people have rumbled you. But by the general election, they will have focused on the issues.
Well, why did Mr Amis leave Basildon
What you're simply getting now is the understandable frustrations of an electorate which have had to accept that there's been a very difficult recession on a word scale, which has actually seen virtually every government in a democracy like ours defeated, with the exception of John Major, who got the biggest vote in the history of the Conservative Party.
Now, Nick Harvey, you heard, there was a person interviewed very interestingly in Basildon who said, well, I'm going to vote Liberal Democrat because they're neither one thing nor the other. You consider that the sort of vote you want?
Certainly not, and if you look at the pattern elsewhere, that's certainly not the way we're performing. We've gained this evening the North Somerset Unitary Authority. We've taken seats from the Tories in Newbury and Eastleigh, which are areas we've controlled up till now, and people are reinforcing what they've seen of Lib Dem local government. The point that Mr Heseltine and the Conservatives have to face is that even if Peter Kellner's quite rosy picture is true and that they have recovered all of 2% on their performance of a year ago, they're running out of time, and if they can only make up 2% on Labour in the course of a year, then they really have very little prospect at all of affecting this recovery that they're trying to talk up and convince everyone exists.
So why has Mr Amis left Basildon? If it's just local elections and you don't need to worry, why has poor old Mr Amis shot off to Southend on the chicken run, or Mr Malwini from Peterborough to Cambridge? They know the result. These are affecting the general election that's coming very shortly.
That's the curious thing about your defence, isn't it, Mr Heseltine? You say that your brilliant local councillors are suffering because people are disenchanted with your government, and yet you say that these results will have nothing to do with a general election.
No, they don't. And we know it because we've seen it so often as a pattern repeated, that you get local government results, a general election a year later. It's just like by-elections. I mean, we lost by-elections in the last Parliament. We won every single one back. We're going to win them all back in the next general election. We shall, in fact, see a very considerable recovery in Conservative fortunes because the economics of this country are as good as they've been for a generation.
Right. OK, let me interrupt you there, because we're going to go across now to Liverpool. Our reporter Alan Ury is there. What's the story there?
Well, Labour is really looking to increase its slender majority on the council. At the start of the evening, they had 50 out of a total of 99 seats. The main contenders are the Liberal Democrats, but I think they're privately admitting that probably their best chance was last year, so it's really a question of whether Labour will consolidate their majority.
Right, well, let's go over now to Fiona Bruce, who's in Huntingdon, the Prime Minister's part of the world, one of the few remaining Conservative councillors. Is it going to stay Conservative after tonight, Fiona?
Well, it looks like it may. We've had 3 definite results in so far, 3 Conservative holds. One of those holds was one that the Lib Dems won briefly, and they were hoping to retain, so they're disappointed about that. We have an unconfirmed report that, in fact, there's a Conservative gain. And clearly, there may be a bit swings and roundabouts later on this evening, but at the moment, it looks like they may keep this heart of Torydom here in Huntingdonshire, and certainly the Conservative leader is pretty confident.
Fiona, thanks very much. One piece of news just come in. It'll gladden the heart of Nick Harvey of the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats have apparently taken Tunbridge Wells, you'll be pleased to hear.
Heart of Tory England.
In Runnymede, which means it looks as if they're now projected to lose Runnymede as well.
Right, well, let's see. Let's just have a look now at the national share of the vote as it's in so far. There it is, as Peter Snow predicted a few moments ago. The Labour Party have 44%, the Conservatives 28%, and the Liberal Democrats 23% of the vote. That's all from Newsnight for tonight. Local election coverage continues on BBC One in 10 minutes. Meanwhile, from all of us on Newsnight, good night.